And with the development of the Back Bay, we have the churches of Boston moving from the crowded downtown area out to this new elegant place. The first was the Federal Street Church, formerly the Long Lane Meeting House, which moved in 1860 to Arlington Street, and because the church would take its name from the place where it was, it is now the Arlington Street Church, and actually was the first large building built in the new Back Bay. Thousands of pilings driven into the mud down to the bedrock below to hold up this elegant edifice facing the Boston Public Garden. 2 years later, an Episcopal congregation, actually launched by a group of abolitionists, built their home on Newbury Street, the Emmanuel Church, again the second of the churches of the Back Bay. And at the end of the Civil War, also on Newbury Street, this one at Berkeley Street, we're on the first blocks after we've left the Public Garden, we have the Central Congregational Church, now the Church of the Covenant, on Newbury Street at Berkeley Street. Even the first church, that is the first church in Boston, the old Church of Winthrop, which had been destroyed in the Great Fire back in 1711, and then built as the brick church, and then moved in 1807 to Chauncey Street, moves to Marlborough Street and Berkeley Street in 1867, now, of course, a Unitarian church. Trinity Church, an Episcopal church on Summer Street, bought a lot in the Back Bay, and their building plan was actually accelerated after the Great Fire of November 1872, destroying their original building. They already were building an elegant building at Copley Square, which opens in 1877. Trinity Church, designed by Henry H. Richardson, with murals and stained glass by John Lafarge, a Romanesque style actually called Richardsonian Romanesque because the architect has such an influence. The time after their building was destroyed and before the new building could open, the congregation would meet in MIT's Rogers Building on the corner of Boylston and Berkeley. Now, Old South, the venerable building on Washington Street, was narrowly saved during the Great Fire of 1872, but already the congregation had its eyes on the Back Bay and was building their new home at Dartmouth and Boylston Street. The fire department firefighters heroically saved their building in November of 1872, but then the congregation was looking to move out, and one way, of course, that you pay to build a new church is to sell the land on which the old one sits. And the Old South congregation were selling the plot of land on which Old South had been since the 1670s. There's a great public outcry when the building is going to be sold and demolished to make way for a modern office building, as these churches sat in what had been Boston's financial district, and the land now is much more valuable than it had been in the 1670s. So the congregation wants to sell the building on Washington Street, as the congregation is building a new home in the Back Bay. Of course, the congregation isn't interested in an old building. They wouldn't be building a new one if they were. However, preservationists and others interested in the history of the building and in the venerable history of Boston organize to save the building. And they managed to do so. Actually, one plan to save the building was to build the modern office building and then put the old church on top of it, having the best of both worlds, a valuable office building and then this historical relic. That particular plan would have been interesting and certainly would have changed the Boston skyline, but it wouldn't really work. The preservationists succeed in saving Old South, and it's actually the second building in the country saved for its historical significance. So we have on Washington Street, and this is one of the sources of confusion for visitors to the city as well as residents, on Washington Street we have the Old South Meeting House, the historical building. This is where Samuel Adams spoke on the night of the Boston Tea Party, and other important historical events have happened. At Copley Square, we have the Old South Church. That's actually where the congregation is. So if someone tells you to meet them at Old South, ask for a little bit more specification. And then another question comes to mind here, as Boston has a tremendous influx of Catholics in this period, and so far I have talked about Protestant churches, elegant buildings being built in the Back Bay. You may ask, where are the Catholics here? Well, in the 1860s, the Archdiocese had built a cathedral on Washington Street in the South End, anticipating, like others, that the South End would be the center of Boston's culture. And the cathedral built there is one of the great cathedrals in the country. Unfortunately, the South End had not become the cultural center of Boston, and the Catholics had trouble building on major streets in other areas. In fact, they were quite openly not welcomed in some places. And the only Catholics at this time living in the Back Bay would have been domestic servants or coach drivers for the people building the elegant homes in the Back Bay, traditionally, or actually overwhelmingly, Protestants. In 1888, this is after the completion of the Back Bay, the Archdiocese created a special parish for these people working in the Back Bay. The domestic servants. St. Cecilia's Parish opens in 1894, actually funded by the domestic servants who make their livings as domestic help and live in the mansions of the Back Bay as servants. So we have the creation of new churches, some of them real cultural and ecclesiastical monuments here in the Back Bay. And again, the mark of the ethnic divisions in Boston are still clear as we head toward the 20th century.